Sup everybody, this is Karak with ACG and happy weekend. What I am doing right now is the first in the video game series Better on VR. What does that mean? Well, basically I go and I grab a game and I try it out on the VR headsets with various different software to see if it improves the gameplay. This is something that people have asked for, but in particular from my own patrons. What does that mean? That means I probably wouldn't even have a Vive without you guys. I probably wouldn't be able to still be doing this without you guys. And of course, credit where credit is due. So when it comes down to it, many of us who have a Rift or who have an HTC Vive, like Requiem, our very own, who shows up on the International Podcast, sometimes you end up just sitting on the headset and you don't really have anything to show for it. When it comes down to it, there aren't any of those really huge AAA games that are made just for the headset. Well, luckily enough, there are various software injectors that can fake 3D, and there are some of the better ones and some of the worst ones. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the game Life is Strange using Vorpx, which is one of the different software injectors. One thing I like about Vorpx is it has a couple different settings that I'm going to describe as we move forward that I think really does offer Life is Strange in a different format, and we can see if it really pays off in the end. I'm going to cover usability and playability, that 3D impact, the atmosphere, and the immersion. So it's going to be like a little tiny bit of a walking the walk, but I'm going to try to keep it under 10 minutes. One word of warning, I won't be posting my settings for Vorpx because every single person's headset is set up just for them. If you want to check out Vorpx, you have to do it. In no way, shape, or form am I connected to them. In fact, I would say you really want to be watchful of if you get it because it is a bit of money and you're not quite sure it's going to work, where the other one, which is like Verario or something like that, it works on far less, but it seems to work a little bit better on those few games it does. Basically, I have a couple settings in Vorpx, and the ones we're going to look at are Virtual Cinema and Not. Let's cover Not because I don't use it much in this game. When you turn the Virtual Cinema off in Vorpx, basically what it does is it sort of smashes the screen up against your face. Now, this is awesome for a couple reasons and terrible for some others. It's awesome because it fully immerses you. Guys, I'm telling you, it's absolutely immersive, especially if you choose, which I'll describe in a little bit, one of the various different types of 3D, which is called geometry. It nails that sense of immersion. However, if you have something like, let's say, the headset tracking on to mimic the mouse and you're looking around, not only does it nail immersion, it also proves the one big problem with VR in a non-VR game. Our friggin' heads don't snap back to center like a damn right thumbstick. So what you get is something called drift. That means if you look to the left as max and then you move the controller to the right to look somewhere else, because of course you're sort of using both in tandem, then you get off center and you have to sort of center yourself multiple times. Now there are various ways to sort of work around this in Vorpx and just basically by the way you play, but in the end I was never really happy. Additionally, because of the way it broadcasts and puts that on your face and adjusts the FOV slightly, I was never able to get it set up just right to where it didn't make me sort of want to Ralph, and it also didn't have some clipping issues. There was always some issues because remember, sometimes you're adjusting the FOV itself, the field of view, and a game like this usually has a rock solid, completely set field of view where they have dialed it to a specific number, and if you add to it, if you make it wider, you will be able to see the world draw in. So unfortunately we couldn't use that, but what we did use is the spectacular, for me at least, working version called Virtual Cinema. Now, Virtual Cinema basically puts a movie theater screen in front of you. You even have different settings. One of the settings is where you're a person, you can look down and you're seeing yourself hold a 360 controller. It's very cool. However, the setting that really intrigues me is the setting you see on your screen right now. This sample here has light bleed on the edges. Now, if you're following anything about VR, one of the things you're hearing is that a lot of companies are looking at putting LED lights around the edges of the lenses in the Oculus or the lenses in the Vive and allowing them to get some color data from the pixels on the edge. What does that do? Well, basically, it fools the brain into thinking that the field of view is much wider than it is. If you'll notice here in my set, you'll see that the game is actually taking samples of color from the edges and bleeding that out. That's why you can see that color shift and change as that police officer moves. So, Virtual Cinema really nails it. However, when you set it up originally, what you end up having is a Virtual Cinema far away from you. It's probably, I would say, it feels maybe 6 to 10 feet. Luckily, what you can do is you can zoom that out. You can basically bring it towards your face or you can zoom it out. But if you bring it towards your face, what happens is you get something very close to what I originally said, which was the cinema off. And of course you can adjust the, use a headset for the mouse, that kind of thing. But really, to be brutally honest, I just left that off. The reason why I left it off is because one of the number one complaints with a lot of gamers is that whenever you put a headset on and you move around with a controller, you start to get sick. Well, because of the way this is set up, you still have very small frames of reference that it is not a full 3D picture or it is not a world wraparound. And so it works very well. Now, moving on from those little bits of technicality, how does it work? Guys, this is fantastic. You know, for the first game, it's a very cool, in a way, sort of a litmus test, because I was in there, I was testing things, I was going through all these settings, tacked another 9 or 10 hours onto the gameplay as I just messed around with all the settings. And you do have to mess around, but if you understand the sweet spot at the starting, I could have probably got this done in 30 minutes, or at least got my settings right in 30 minutes, because it wasn't too hard. Once you stop trying to fully immerse yourself by using the cinema off, and you put the cinema on, and then you bring it close to you, and you sort of use this one, which I think is better than the movie theater style, where around the screens of the border you see a movie theater, you just get this overly impressive picture. Now, when it comes to the different settings, there are 3 settings that you really care about in Vorpx itself, and I don't know if these exist in the other one or in some of the older injectors, but I would assume something like that exists. You have 3 different settings. You have geometric 3D and Z-buffer 3D. So the Z-buffer 3Ds, there's 2 versions of it. Use the buffer in the graphics engine and the graphics card, and it sort of figures out the different frames, and it basically gets you a fairly rough 3D picture. Geometry is much better. I can't tell you just how much better. You can sort of mess around with the Z-buffer versions, and you can really extend out your 3D stereo, and you can get some fairly close approximations. But geometry really nails it. However, it has its own issues, including it certainly does seem to hit the frame rate a little harder. What did I settle for? Well, because frame rate's such a big deal, I ended up settling for a Z-buffer version. There's Z-buffer alternate and Z-buffer normal, and I don't really know 100% what the 2 differences are between those. I'm assuming one is the normal way of getting the Z-buffer difference, and the other is some alternate, possibly faster way. What I did was I tried those. I extended the separation of the stereo. All that's doing is basically sort of making the picture deeper by taking that data and sort of adjusting it. And I gotta say, guys, it absolutely rocks. One of the great things about Life is Strange is its color palette works directly in contrast to the weakness of the Vive and the Oculus Rift, which is their screen door effect. Now, the screen door effect is where you can see the edges between pixels on your Vive or your Oculus Rift. Here's a problem. Those edges are dark. So when you get into a dark area, like, say, VR pool, a dark area already looks even more dark, and it can create a muddy look. The brighter something is, the easier it really is to see. And when I was playing Everspace, I was trying to explain that to people who had been playing Elite. And in Elite, you do have some bright areas, but Everspace as a whole is just very, very bright. You can really see it, and it really dials down, it really hits. And luckily, that is mimicked perfectly in Life is Strange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences that we see here in atmosphere versus true immersion and true presence. There has always been an atmosphere to Life is Strange that I like. If you like any kind of third-person walk-around, exploration game of Sherlock Holmes, and you like their atmosphere, well, stay tuned, because that's what we're talking about here. The difference between atmosphere and immersion is that atmosphere is really basically ends at the screen in front of you, where immersion, usually allowed by a Vive or an Oculus or some other kind of VR, allows you to feel like you're inside of it, especially, for example, like I said, if you have the mouse connected to the head tracking so you can look around in some of these games. It can work really well, but be a little janky. So what I'm going to do is jump a little forward. So I love it when a new technology makes you look back at old things, whether that be a new car allows you to go to a racetrack and race it and feel that new amount of power. Here, it's a VR that really allows me to jump in, add 3D to this, and feel the complexity and depth to locations that I never felt prior. I always was very happy with the locations in this game, but I have to say, when you get this software injector working right, it will blow your mind. The feeling of depth is there. The feeling of characters existing within the space is far beyond the original 2D game. And I know some people may say, well, 2D isn't actually accurate because it is a 3D game within the actual monitor itself. That is true, but you are still experiencing it through that 2D field of the edge of the monitor. Here, you're able to actually interact with it in a different way, and it really does add to it. Now, people who have 3D glasses and stuff like that, as long as they can get it working, could experience a good amount of this as well, so always remember that. You will see some errors with some of these software injectors, however. For example, here you see basically the reflection, and occasionally you'll see little errors in the reflection. That's because when you dial this down, you sort of decide how 3D you want it. You can make it just barely 3D, or you can really nail it. If you really nail it, sometimes you get what we see here, which is that the dispenser for hand towels looks odd, as if it's basically floating in the air in the reflection. Now, that's basically because you choose that separation of 3D and the reflection which is a special effect done by the card and on certain materials within any video game, is seeing what it's trying to see, but then it also sees this injection, and the injection gets that calculation wrong, and you get the situation we have here. The great thing is, within the headset, I don't see that issue. It's far less pronounced, at least, and I can dial it down to being unnoticeable. However, it would still be there slightly regardless. In the end, I think it's actually a fairly good trade-off. I think the easiest way to really look at a game and identify if it is better or if it at least is in some way suited to that 3D treatment and that step over and that change up is looking at, does it actually add to the ability of the game to deliver atmosphere? And I have to say that, at least for me, this absolutely does. Every single thing here is closer to you, and you're more engaged with it. In fact, the first thing I noticed, and I showed this to a couple people as I made this video, is that the color of that light as it fades out makes you a little bit claustrophobic because everything is dark right outside that light. It's not hyper noticeable, but noticeable. And of course here, one of the best environments for the 3D setting that I found is the fireflies. Now these are full 3D creations in the game engine, but when you walk around and you've got the Vive on, man, this absolutely nails it. So I told you guys I was going to talk about playability. You know, as I stated before, it does actually increase the feeling of depth, of horizontal realness to this game that wasn't there before. Now, when I say horizontal and not vertical, it's because, to be honest, you don't really go up anywhere. If you notice in a lot of these games, a couple sets of steps maybe, but that's about it. Here, a lot of it is just on that 2D plane, that 2D field. And I think in many ways that sort of helps it out. Because as I'm walking here, it's very difficult to describe to you, because you can't see it, just how all of these effects play out in a far more magical way than they did in the original game. And I'm sure you guys know, I adored this game normally, absolutely adored it. So being able to see this in 3D really is sort of eye-opening when it comes to particular titles that are able to do this without seeing a lot of technical difficulties, because technical difficulties will come up. I'm covering a bunch of games in this series. I'll probably never stop doing it until everybody owns a damn 3D headset. I think the last thing I want to mention is when you add all this up and you put on a good pair of headphones and you sort of experience all this in a 3D world, and especially if you can find a game that allows you to use the mouse as the look button, and hopefully they'll continue to refine that, you have a game that isn't first person but still really nails that 3D look. And there is something different about glasses that are 3D, which I've owned, and a Vive or a Rift. A Vive or a Rift really closes you off completely from the outside world. I've had 3D glasses. You can look to your left and look to your right and still see people. So that feeling of immersion is still there, but it's not exactly nailed down. Here, I have to say, Life is Strange nails it, especially when you get some good headphones on and you just sort of jump in. So like I said, I was going to keep this short and didn't get a chance to, but we're going to cut it off here. Is Life is Strange better on VR? Yeah, completely. It's absolutely a super interesting experience once you can get that VR up and running. I could have got it up and running far faster had I not wanted to push the effect and really see just how far I could get it. The game looks phenomenal in 3D. Its color palette really speaks to the weaknesses of these headsets, and instead of making them sort of appear smudgy and dirty, it really elevates their picture due to the pastels and the brighter colors, except for, of course, here in Depression Room Alley. So as always, if you guys like the video, check us out on Patreon, Twitter, all those kind of things. You know, maybe even use the Amazon affiliates if you decide to buy something, like an Oculus Rift. Just joking. If you dislike the video, give it a thumbs down. And as always, I'm going to leave this, as I leave most things, with a crying girl.